Your house should be the one place you never lock your guard down, the place you sink into your couch, unbutton your shirt, turn off the porch light, and finally breathe. These 3 stories are about when that went wrong, about ordinary nights that stopped being ordinary, about sounds that shouldn't have been there, about a dog who knew something before we did, about a smart speaker that stopped behaving like a tool and started behaving like an accuser. They are true accounts from people I know or met, not urban legends stitched together. Listen to them with your lights on. If you want more real horror like this, hit subscribe. These are true stories, and you won't want to miss the next one. My dog wouldn't come to bed that night. He sat at the top of the stairs and stared. Not the distracted, I hear a squirrel stare. Not the selfish, if you get up to feed me, I'll look stare. It was the stare that gripped my chest like a hand and didn't let go. Jojo's eyes were wide and fixed, his whole body angled toward the basement. He didn't shift, he didn't plead. He just sat there, low and solemn as a statue, and refused to move. Growing up in that house, the basement always had a memory attached to it. It was where the family stored seasonal things, where the water heater hummed, where Uncle Steve once taught me how to set a fishing hook without splintering a finger. Uncle Steve was not my father. He came along after my dad left, if you can call it coming along. He was a brother to my mum, and more like a gentle, loud-voiced guardian to me. He had a laugh you could hear down the block. For a long time, his visits were the best parts of summer. Cold beers on the back stoop, poker games, the smell of menthol cigarettes, and him telling ridiculous stories that left me laughing until my sides hurt. Then overnight in my memory, his visits stopped. I remember Christmases without him, a chair that stayed empty, a silence at family gatherings that felt heavy like a lid. Mom would say he had some health stuff, or that he went to see his doctor more often, and I took it like a kid takes vague explanations, because what else was I supposed to do? Years later, she told me he had died. I don't remember the funeral very clearly. I remember the last time I saw him alive, the way he clapped me on the shoulder and winked like he'd left me some private joke to carry forward. After Mom decided to move to assisted living, I inherited the house. It was mine, in the sense that the mortgage was in my name and my stuff filled the rooms, but it still smelled like other people's lives, Old Spice and wool coats, the residual sweetness of too much perfume on Christmas mornings, the faint grease of the kitchen range. Jojo was an old Australian shepherd who'd followed me home the week I'd moved in from a college dorm. He'd been through 3 apartments and 2 relationships with me. He knew how to read a couch like it was a map. The first night he sat at the stairs was late October. The heat had been turned off downstairs, and the air smelled of dust and the remains of a candle I hadn't bothered to blow out. I was half asleep on the couch with the TV on some late-night cooking show, the sort of thing I did when I didn't want real noise in the house. When Jojo fixed himself at the stairs, I patted his head and told him to come up. He made a small, almost offended sound, dug his paws into the carpet and planted himself there. I laughed at him and got up. The house groaned the way old houses do. The floorboards expand and contract, pipes settle into their elbows, the radiator sighs. I remember thinking about the little noises, the familiar accordion fold of a home that has been lived in for a score of years. But the smell was different that night. Under the dust was a faint scent like cigarette smoke and lemon cleaner, layered in a way that said someone had been here, not lately, but recently enough. "Jojo," I said, "come on, bed." He didn't. He looked past me, over my shoulder, down the basement steps. The basement stairs were narrow and low. I had ducked through them 1,000 times as a kid, shoulders brushing the wood. At the bottom, the light was a single bulb that always flickered like it wanted to die. I flicked the switch and it hummed to life, the light swallowing the room in a yellow kitchen-like glow. Boxes lined the walls. There was the old freezer my mom refused to throw away, a broken washer, bags of holiday lights, and up against the far wall, a recliner with a blanket draped over it. The blanket had been there since my mother had moved in, and it took me a moment to associate it with memory rather than neglect. Then I heard it, a voice, small from the crawl space side of the furnace. It said my name. The voice was weak, like someone had tried to speak through smoke. It wasn't a shout or a man trying to frighten me. It was a clear, deliberate, "Hey!" And then my name. It was the voice I hadn't heard for years. It was Uncle Steve's cadence, the slight prolonging of vowels that he used when he wanted to make a joke or make a point, or get my attention. I froze on the stairs. Jojo's fur bristled. He made a sound, half growl, half whine, and leaned into the down draft that came up from the furnace. We both stood like that, me gripped by a sudden cold that wasn't just the basement chill, Jojo trembling at my feet. The rational parts of my brain were busy. Of course, someone was downstairs. Maybe it was a neighbor who had a key. Maybe my mother had come back for something she forgot. Maybe Uncle Steve had a brother who sounded like him. Maybe it was wind making the HVAC hiss into a syllable. I thought all those things in the same breath I couldn't say anything aloud. "Steve," I called without thinking, because it felt less insane if I said it like it could be real. The silence that answered was the wrong kind of silence, the kind that presses against your ears. Then the light at the base of the furnace buzzed. Behind the shelving, something shifted. I called the police because I didn't know what else to do. I called my neighbor because people do that when they're scared. You call someone who knows your default courage level and hope they'll come give you a spokesman's steady hand. The officers arrived, polite and quietly efficient. They walked the basement with flashlights, they lifted boxes, they checked doors and windows. They said their formal words. They left their prints on the banister. They told me they'd searched the house thoroughly and found no one. They told me to sleep at my neighbor's if I felt like it, and handed me a police report number that sat on my kitchen counter like an invitation to the unknown. After they left, Jojo refused to go downstairs for a week. He would pace at the top of those stairs and look down as if following somebody only he could see. He would not let me close the door to the basement without sitting in the center of the floor and watching me. When the house was quiet, he would stand and stare at the basement door, hackles raised, ears forward, as if listening not for footsteps but for the grief of a dead man who had perhaps remembered a commonplace thing and chosen to say hello. 2 days later, I called Mom. Her voice was labyrinthine with condolences and mother-protective tones. She told me again to take my time, to sleep over at a friend's house, to let the house settle. When I asked her directly, uncertain, like a child trying to make sense of a tall tale, if Uncle Steve had ever been down in that basement recently, she got quiet. "He died 3 years ago," she said gently, the way you tell someone a truth that's hard to understand because it hurts them to know it. "You remember, things were messy. We had his things moved right after." But the voice I heard had been him. It had been his manner, his inflection. It had called my name like he had 100 times. The police found nothing. Mom confirmed he wasn't alive. Jojo refused to go downstairs. After a week of fits and waking up sweating, I handed the house keys back to my mother. She sold the place 2 months later to a young family who wanted the porch swing. I moved into a small apartment with new locks, and I took Jojo to my brother's until I could find a place that wasn't full of stairs and traps of memory. Even now, when the house comes up in conversation, I can feel the way my throat tightens. I don't try to explain it as anything. I only tell it as I experienced it. A dog that refused to cross an invisible line, a voice that sounded like a man I loved and lost, and the thin, unbearable certainty that something in that house was still speaking in a language I recognized. The police said no intruder. My mother said he had been dead for years. All the rest is left in the dark, where Jojo kept his watch. Homes keep their history. Sometimes it's photos and mail and the smell of soup. Sometimes it's a voice you thought you'd buried. The second story is about footsteps below, Real ones, tangible and human-sounding at times, the kind that make the floorboards vibrate like a heartbeat. It happened to someone else I know. I was there when she told me, because some lines in that conversation were said with that particular tremor that makes you want to listen close. I was sleeping above a completely empty floor, she told me. The first floor of the house had been gutted for renovations. There were plans and dust and a lot of dislocated energy about the place. I rented the second floor because it was cheap and close to work. The landlord lived out of state, and his communication was perpetually, "I'll get to it," until eventually it became, "I meant to. I'm sorry." The first night she heard the footsteps, it was late, around 3 in the morning, when the world folds back into itself and the city becomes an animal of measured breaths. She woke because of the noise. It wasn't delicate. It was the sound of someone walking, decisively and with purpose, like someone who knew their destination. The sound traveled through her floor, setting the plates in the kitchen to remind her that the house had more than one story. At first she told herself it was a worker. Maybe someone had a key and had come for a late shift. Maybe a neighbor forgot to bring up an important tool. She got up and peered through the blinds. The street was empty. A folding ladder was propped against a neighboring stoop, but that only added to her unease. No truck idled, no flashlight beams strobed the walls. The footsteps kept happening. They came on nights when there was no work scheduled. Sometimes it was a single set of strides that began at the back of the house and walked slow to fast, like someone pacing while waiting for something that never arrived. Other nights there were small thumps, cabinet doors shutting softly, a muffled scrape as if someone brushed against the lower-level counter. Once she woke to the smell of cigarette smoke so sharp it burned the back of her throat, even though she hadn't been near a cigarette all week. She called the landlord. He said he'd send someone. Weeks passed. He said he had a contractor in mind. He said he trusted the locks, but that sometimes siding came loose and animals found their way in. He did not say, "I'll be right there." He did not say, "We'll change the locks tomorrow." His apologies were a calendar of delays. One night, after an episode of particularly agonized pacing downstairs, she called the police. She was young and tired of feeling watched. The officers came, polite and procedural and efficient. They swept the house. They checked the basement, the crawl space, the exterior perimeter. They found nothing that night either. No footprints, no one hiding in the dark, no forced entry. The official language was, "No signs of forced entry," and no one currently on the premises. They left behind the soft, professional condolence that does not make a thing go away. But she insisted there had been someone. A smell of cigarette, a misplaced cabinet hinge, a towel moved from a closet to the floor. She didn't want to move, not right away. She couldn't afford the sudden expense, and the apartment above the gutted first floor had rent lower than anything in the neighborhood. She tried to rationalize. A late-night smoker could be a neighbor, a homeless person could have wooden ways of getting in, but the things anecdotally stacked against luck. A couple weeks later, while she was cleaning under the kitchen cabinet, she found a cigarette butt tucked behind the pipework. It wasn't just a butt thrown down the drain. It was hidden, like someone had wanted to make sure it didn't get found. The filter bore an imprint of lipstick, a small tell that someone had used it recently. She put it in a bag like evidence and carried it to the landlord, whose voice on the phone finally sharpened. He admitted, after the butt and after a quiet, embarrassed pause, that one of the basement windows didn't lock properly. He said it in the same breath a man gives when he's been found out about an oversight he'd been ignoring. He said he'd send a locksmith next week. She moved the following month. The notice came earlier than the locksmith and the landlord's sorry words. When she turned the key for the last time and closed the door, the house sounded smaller. The rent she left behind was cheap, but the sound of someone walking underneath her bed had become priceless, the cost intangible. She found herself flinching at every shadow under the sinks in subsequent places she rented. She would wake sometimes in a stranger's apartment at 3 in the morning, listening for a step that wasn't there, waiting for a sound that would label the place unsafe. When I asked why she hadn't called the police more, why she hadn't gone door to door, she told me the truth, that people who live above renovating floors will tell you, calling the police once is like putting a mark on your life. After the first visit they will listen, but they won't necessarily stay. Experience trains you to make hard decisions. Should you get mad now or sleep on the couch and call tomorrow? Most nights she chose the couch and a futile playlist on her phone. It was cheaper than upheaval. The cigarette butt wasn't proof of a ghost, but it was proof someone had been in the empty house. The police said they found no one the night they came. The landlord owed a long string of delays. The aftertaste of those nights lingered. She moved, but the sound of footsteps never quite left her. Homes are porous in ways we don't like to admit. They leak security as easily as heat. The third story is the one about technology, about a smart speaker that started acting like it had a mind, or like someone else had the remote and was setting a cruel scene. Chris told me this one. He was 22 then. Not quite sure he had the language to explain how the house stopped being a refuge and started feeling like a staged performance. He'd been living with his brother Tom, while Tom was deployed for a few months. Chris worked nights, had a messy schedule, and left the heavy tasks to the two of them. The house was a shallow, friendly chaos, the kind of place where dishes pile and someone puts laundry on a chair and hopes for forgiveness the next morning. On the kitchen counter sat an Alexa. It had been a birthday present Tom left on the counter, and they never unplugged it. It was one of those devices that listened in the background and answered simple things: weather, timer, music. They never thought twice about it. One night Chris was up watching a football game on his laptop and half asleep on the couch. It was the kind of late-night routine that makes life feel ordinary. Two brothers afloat in the same small world. The Alexa had a playlist favorited under Tom's account, a series of songs that snapped the late-night silence to life. Around midnight, a song started playing out of nowhere. It was not one Chris had asked for. The lights were dim, but the kitchen glowed like a white stage. "Alexa, stop," Chris said without moving, more as a reflex than a command. Music continued. Chris frowned. He reached over and unplugged the speaker. The lights from its ring went dark. The music stopped. He sat back and inhaled, telling himself it was a glitch. He told himself the moral story: electronics misbehave. He told himself many things to calm down. A few minutes later, the music started again, softer this time, like someone had turned a radio on in the house below. He walked over, hands a little shaky, and found the speaker unplugged. The plug hung from the counter like a trailing thought. The ring was dark, yet the music played, thin and distant, as if coming from the hallway. He walked out to the entryway and down the stairs. The hallway light was off. The front door looked shut. He searched the rooms like a man who doesn't want to give voice to what he's afraid of finding. There was nothing. The hair at the back of his neck lifted and refused to smooth back down. Then he heard the whisper. It wasn't a command spoken into the dark. It was a voice that sounded vaguely like a neighbor, dim and breathy and close to the floorboards. "Play his song," it said. The phrasing was casual, like someone telling a friend to unpause something. The voice came from below, from the empty lower floor. Chris froze for a second, and then his feet carried him out onto the porch. He grabbed his phone and called 911 because his voice hitched at the thought that whoever was down there wasn't just moving. They were making themselves at home with his music. The dispatcher was calm and practiced. Officers came and walked through the house with flashlights and formal seriousness. The front door was open when they arrived. The police said it likely blew open because the latch was weak. That wind could have done it, that an open door in a quiet neighborhood at that hour is often the product of neglect rather than malice. They found scuff marks on the threshold, small abrasions that could have been from someone shoving at the frame. They found a blanket behind the couch in a closet, the blanket folded but warm, like someone had curled up there and left. The officers took a statement and wrote down what Chris described. Music playing, Alexa unplugged, a whisper that said, "Play his song," and an open door. They found no one. The formal language again, no suspects on scene. But the physical marks were there. The evidence was not a ghost. It was an intrusion. The door had been forced open. Something had been in the house that night. Someone had used the speaker, or at least given a spoken cue, that whisper, and had then left a blanket, as if they had slept briefly. After that night, cameras went up on the porch. The family installed a deadbolt with a slam bar. Tom returned, and they argued quietly about whether to make a big deal or quietly pack and leave. The authorities ran a report, and the house became the sort of place that keeps receipts for its fear. For Chris, the worst part wasn't the physical invasion. It was the way the device, a household object, had been used as intermediary. The Alexa had been turned into a voice that belonged to someone else. The music that had always been comforting turned traitorous. Every time a device chimed, the house flinched. Months later, Chris told me he kept waking at night with the idea that machines had been listening and had decided something about him. He could not say whether someone had been inside the house and manipulated the device manually, or whether it had been some hack, or whether someone had simply commanded it from outside. What was certain was this: a voice that was supposed to be a tool had been used in a way that made the house feel unmoored. Later, after they moved, Chris installed a small camera on the porch and a motion sensor. The footage showed cars driving by and a raccoon that liked to visit the trash cans. Nothing else. No silhouette, no fingers lingering on the door. The blanket disappeared from the closet after a week, when an officer saying it might have evidence took it for testing and never returned it. The lack of closure was more haunting than the thing itself. What ties these three stories together is how thin the line is between ordinary life and unsafety. In my first story, a voice known to me like the shape of my own name returned when it should not have. No one can tell me why Uncle Steve's voice said hello that night, and no one can tell my dog why he refused to cross the threshold. In the second, someone made their way into a supposedly empty lower floor and left a cigarette butt like punctuation. In the third, a device built to make life easier became an instrument of trespass. I want to be clear about what the police said and didn't say. In each instance, officers came. They checked the houses. They found no one at the time. They documented their visits. That is a fact. What is also a fact is that each narrator, me, my friend, Chris, found something afterward that indicated a presence of some kind had been in the house. That cigarette butt, that scuff mark, that blanket folded but warm, and that dog who would not cross the stairs. Each outcome was different. One house was sold because it felt too heavy to stay in. One person packed quickly and left after deciding the risk wasn't worth the rent. One family installed cameras and changed locks and never quite smiled at home again. The thread through them is the erosion of the home as a sanctuary. When ordinary things, pets, footsteps, a smart speaker, begin to assert themselves in ways that imply company, the safety people assume about their walls begins to peel. People ask me if I think any of these were supernatural. I tell them I don't know. It's not a comfortable answer. Skepticism is healthy. Sometimes houses creak, sometimes rodents, raccoons happen, sometimes the wiring glitches and plays a song, sometimes a neighbor with a spare key comes in for a quick smoke, sometimes the mind stitches together what it needs to understand a noise. And yet, in each of these, the evidence had an angle that dents easy explanations. The dog knew something that night. The cigarette butt under the cabinet had lipstick on it. The speaker had been unplugged and still played, and the front door was open when the police arrived. These aren't neat puzzles with clean solutions. They are irritations on your skin that won't go away, the kind you awake to and cannot explain. What I want you to carry from these is not a step-by-step instruction on how to avoid trouble. Locks and cameras and neighbor checks are practical and necessary, but none of those mechanics really get at the feeling of being violated in the one place you thought exempt from danger. The point is this: our homes can keep secrets, and sometimes the secrets are made of other people's small actions. Someone entering a basement to smoke and calling you by the name of someone who is gone. Someone practicing the casual command, "Play his song," into a speaker. Someone slipping in the night and leaving a blanket in a closet. There are small, mundane precautions that help. Change old locks. Install a decent deadbolt. Don't leave windows unsecured. Keep better track of who has keys. Let neighbors know if you work nights so someone can check on the place. If a dog refuses to do something, don't write it off as stubbornness. Pets register things we can't myself. Trust them more often than you don't. Call someone when you feel unsafe, and try to stay with a friend if you can while the authorities investigate. All that is sensible. But these stories also show that even reasonable precautions don't always cure the feeling of being watched. Evidence can be sparse, and police reports can be sterile. Grief and fear and a little humiliation get tangled up in the aftermath. People move out and keep their homes in pieces inside their heads. Friends call and ask what happened, and you find yourself stumbling over the truth because the truth sits like a stone in your throat. The more frightening part is how ordinary all of this was. None of the houses were mansions with a history of curses. None of the incidents had dramatic, cinematic violence. They were small, domestic breaches, footsteps on an empty floor, a voice from a place meant to be empty, a device playing the song it shouldn't. They were the sort of things you would explain away if you could. They are the reasons you keep your lights on during storms, and the reasons you triple-check that your door is locked with your thumb under the deadbolt, because someone taught you to not rely only on what feels true in the moment. I still think about Jojo sitting at the top of the stairs, the way his eyes caught the light and refused to move. I think about the cigarette butt tucked behind a pipe and how deliberately someone hid it. I think about Chris unplugging the speaker and how, on some level, the house changed language the moment a human voice became the enemy. If you've had something like this, tell us in the comments. When people share, it doesn't solve the problem, but it strips a little of the weight off the story because you learn you're not the only person who woke up to a noise and couldn't sleep after. If this gave you chills, like the video and subscribe for more real horror stories. Share it with someone who thinks their house is safe. Even the safest places can surprise you. Before I go, the last thing I'll tell you is small and I think the most cruel. A few months after I moved out of that house with the basement, I was renting a different place with no stairs, a tiny 2-bedroom above a laundromat. One night I woke and I heard a sound like someone descending steps. It was a dream. I told myself it was a dream. I lay in the dark and waited for Jojo's bark that never came. The sound was a small, slow drag, one step another, until it became a rhythm that my heart knew. I sat up and listened, and the silence answered like a presence. The house had no stairs. The sound was inside my head. Or it was not. I don't try to name it now. I only know that some sounds follow you, and some places carry their memories with them like smoke clinging to a sleeve. Lock your doors, listen to your dogs, and when a device in your house speaks when it shouldn't, treat that voice like someone else's in your living room.